Okay, hey.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Art Salon. It is a pleasure and honor to kick it off this year. The title of our panel is Painting and Misappropriation, Richard Phillips and Adolf Dietrich. And I'm very happy to welcome Beatrix to my far left. She's a prolific curator and director. I think everybody knows her. Probably not everyone knows her whole career and the range of her activities during the last 20 years. And maybe some people know that she worked many years ago for the estate of Adolf Dietrich, for the Kunstmuseum Thurgau Kartase Ittingen, and that she is beyond her expertise in contemporary art. She has also a great knowledge of historic art and is to a certain extent an Adolf Dietrich expert. To my left, Richard Phillips. It's also not a major job to introduce Richard Phillips to the audience. I mean, he's one of the most famous painters in the 21st century. He's also one of the painters who's able to bring painting into controversial patterns and discussions, and I think he's a proof that you can be a painter and really bring a discourse to the edge in contemporary art. I just want to go back 12 months. Actually, 12 months ago, most of us were in Venice at the Venice Biennale, and I got approached by Beatrix and Richard, and they said, "You have to make this show." And I asked, "Which show?" They said, "Yes, Adolf Dietrich and Richard Phillips. That's your show." And my first reaction was, yes, that's my show, because I'm the director of the Swiss Institute. And what we try to do is really to build up a platform between an American audience and a European audience. And we also try to have like chapters of art history and also of contemporary art read in another way. We try to bring in different angles. And we run this kind of boutique Kunsthalle Switzerland in New York. So it was a lot of work in between. It sounds like an easy job, these 12 months. But a lot of things happened. And Painting and Misappropriation is the title of two things. On one hand, it's a show, and we're going to show you a couple of images from that show that is currently at the Swiss Institute until June 26th. On the other hand, it's a brand new catalog that we just, actually, it's the launching at this very place, at this very moment. So maybe we're just going to go through, and I invite you to freestyle or to bring in your views or your comment, Beatrix and Richard.
Okay. Well, this particular image that we're starting off with is in the final room of the exhibition. The exhibition was organized in three spaces. There was the initial space in the gallery, and I should say that Gianni had a large role in kind of partitioning off these groupings of works. But this particular space is the last space, and it's kind of a menagerie of paintings of various animals and themes of, in this case, the Vanitas. This is a painting from mine from 2007, Vanitas, and it's a portrait of a painting from the Beaux-Arts Museum in Dijon of a familiar subject of Vanitas as seen by a 17th century anonymous German painter. And then to the right of it we have a painting by Adolf Dietrich, which were two taxidermied owls in front of a landscape. And so this was the menagerie of animals, images of death and of beauty, and we can see it kind of pulling back. To the right now you see a painting of mine from 1997, which was titled Mouser, which is a portrait of a meowing cat. And to the left of it you have a portrait of the same cat twice by Adolf Dietrich. And on to the right of it too, you're going to see a painting titled Basket of Kittens. Now the whole the relationship to these images that I have, in this case, these paintings were not directly appropriated, but were established retrospectively after I became further aware of Adolf Dietrich's work. I should say that I was initially introduced to his work by Peter Fischli at the Kunsthalle in Zurich, where on the second floor there's a very beautiful drawing of two squirrels in a tree. And it was only after a dinner that I had with Beatrix and Peter that I was shown Adolf Dietrich's work for the first time. And I was told that he was essentially a national treasure of Switzerland, but that's about as far as I knew at the time. And when I came back to New York, I received an early version of the catalog raisonné from Beatrix as a gift. And at that point, since it was entirely written in German, and unfortunately I don't read German at all, I began looking through the book, looking through the paintings, and seeing the images and photography that were produced at that time that showed his life and work. Now, at that point, my misreading, in a way, my misappropriation of Adolf Dietrich's work began. Because at that point, I made this painting of Adolf Dietrich's painting without having seen the painting, but only from that reproduction of the two squirrels in the tree. And my painting is titled Similar to Squirrels. And at that point, I still didn't know his history. I still didn't know what the relationship of his work to the photographs of him making his work were. And so that became a kind of unraveling that over the next literally 7 years became a fact that came into my work and exited my work. And the idea of the stability of meaning, or that which is purported to be content, became entirely debatable.
So maybe just to name it, to the left you have Adolf Dietrich, two squirrels in a tree from 1939. And on the right side, you have two squirrels similar to after Adolf Dietrich from 2003. And actually, you painting after a page from a book printed in the 70s.
Yes.
And the first time you saw Adolf Dietrich's painting was at the Swiss Institute.
That's correct.
Can you maybe describe the moment when you start to discover all these originals?
Well, I mean, in essence, I'd only seen that one drawing back in 2003. And after an exhibition I did at Gagosian Gallery last March, not this most recent March, but the March before, I had used I had used one Adolf Dietrich painting in two of my paintings as backdrops. So they were partial appropriations of his image. And at that point, Bettina Funke from Parquet magazine had asked me to write a text on Adolf Dietrich, which seemed appropriate. The only problem being I'd only seen one drawing, and I had read no text or had no access to his history because there were so few, there were no texts written in English at all anywhere. So I decided to make a pilgrimage, in a sense, to Ittingen, to the Kunstmuseum Thurgau, to see my first Adolf Dietrich paintings. And then I hired a student in Berlin to translate texts. And so it became clear to me that my understanding of work was entirely false, that everything that I thought about his work was an assumption on my part. It had nothing to do with his history whatsoever. And so that kind of crisis of realizing that I had believed what was happening through the painting and what was happening through the media surrounding his work to be true became the falsehood. And in a way, the falsehood took on as much meaning as the truth or the validity of history had afterwards. And so at that point, I began to rethink what the potential for the correct or incorrect readings of history could be, which is essentially a subject of my work anyhow. And then we came up with the idea together that this could be a proposition for an exhibition.
But it also, I think there's two strands already you mentioned. It's like, in general, the misreading of, let's say, Dietrich's work historically in the history of his life. And also, the other strand is the way he's actually developed his work, or his practice in doing his paintings with the half, double, missing appropriation of images he took in photography or drawings. But I think it's probably important to know that Adolf Dietrich was, of course, a so-called naive artist, but he got very famous in the context of Neue Sachlichkeit before the Second World War, and he was in all the international exhibitions at the time. So many exhibitions of Neue Sachlichkeit, Adolf Dietrich was represented, and then when in Germany the activities of cleaning national came up, his work was recognized as a work which contained foreign fauna and flora, and somehow he could not be in that shows anymore. And he was kind of rejected back to a local, not even national context of showing his work. And the main perception, or probably also an excuse of perceiving him in Switzerland, was that to claim he's a pure naive artist. And of course, we had many discussions about that when we looked at the work together. Where naivety ends maybe in his work, or how you would define what is going beyond or is staying in the realm of the naive artist. But it's very interesting once that there is a misappropriation of the work of Adolf Dietrich in general, and your appropriations, of course, are based on that misunderstanding and misappropriations of the historical facts that developed in his life. And I think that's a very crucial point to that show you actually created in the end. No?
Right. I mean, in the sense, even in this picture here, where you have on the far right a portrait of a marine recruitment advertisement with a quotation of Adolf Dietrich in the background, and to the left of that you have the painting which shows, it's not the specific painting from which I got that landscape, but you have a painting that shows the exact same frozen lake. Now the frozen lake paintings of Dietrich are important in the sense that they were his most well-known works. They took place in the 1940s and depicted the Lake Constance and the coast of Germany, and it's usually ascribed these depopulated existential or portraits of alienation in the landscape, and also a carrying on of the Swiss tradition of the picturesque. For me, served as a way of destabilizing the image of a false valor. Now, the portrait of the Marine recruitment is a male model who's been hired by the U.S. military to stand in for a multiracial carrier of the idea of valor and honor and heroism. And with that work, that deliberate perpetration of a falsehood as seduction becomes the subject of that painting. Now, if we go back to the painting on the other side of the room.
But I think it's very, probably not all of you know where Adolf Dietrich lived. He lived on the Swiss side of the Lake of Constance.
That's right.
Looking towards the German side of the Lake of Constance. And particularly in the late 30s, during Second World War, he made a huge amount of this very dark, almost dark seascapes, winter seascapes of the Lake of Constance, which was his home, not only but also his desire in a way. Looking at history, which is also a very influential history of his biographical reality. Like being pushed out of that accessibility of an international career as an artist,
right?
And facing the brutality of war, and that was very close there. I mean,
What is interesting, I guess, is also that all these theories are like art historical theories. And of course, there's always the will of synchronization between the work
Absolutely.
and the life of an artist. And it makes a lot of sense. But it's also kind of a load, it's a symbolic load of a painting to a certain extent. And it's really interesting because that's what you do too. Like you cut out certain chapters or certain ideas about things, for example, about the Marines, recruitment, also like you use the title as an additional colors in your work, like
Right.
to bring an additional layer on the top of it. And for me, it was really interesting to discover, like first I was always a little bit hesitant because I thought, so, oh, Adolf Dietrich, I mean, he's Swiss and he's dead, and we're the Swiss Institute. So you don't want to, you want to make sure, you know, that the historical position is in safe hands. And for me, it was so interesting to discover actually that Dietrich was very related in his way of reaching out to the perfect painting. Like he was a painter, he wanted to make great paintings, and he was highly opportunistic. Like he was not naive at all eventually.
No, not at all.
And it was
No,
so
he
interesting.
signed with AD, like Albrecht Dürer.
Yeah, it shows his ambitions.
Well, one of the ways in which I misread his work was that he did a public relations campaign with his art dealer and with a writer. I mean, Herbert Tannenbaum and Franz Roh, who wrote about his work, decided that for their short-term gains, in a way, that they could reaffirm or really establish this idea of him being a naive or a simple woodsman artist. So, contrary to his actual practice, which involved a kind of montage that he created in his studio using photography and drawing and collage, and he never painted from life. He never painted out in nature. It was entirely synthesized within his studio, which is hard to imagine when you actually see the works because there isn't a correspondence that way. But so they staged images of him with an easel outside making paintings in the landscape, or him, you know, bent over a log with a saw sawing wood, you know, in the sense that he was the simple tradesman who was, you know, on his spare time somehow making these phenomenal paintings, that there was a kind of rarity. So,
I mean, it's very interesting if you get the chance to read more about him. It's really hilariously interesting to see how this artist, who is supposedly a naive artist, had developed an incredible pragmatism. You know, like when he, someone gave him a camera and immediately he threw away his drawing book, and from then on only used the camera to develop a system of doing collages to also supply the demanding market on his works, to combine elements and remodel paintings he wanted to do by combining details from one painting to the other. Or also the whole idea that a naive artist is not, you know, is kind of a victim of himself or herself. He was very, very precise in self-mythologizing. So the same way boys would do,
exactly.
he would come up with a mythology about his life and how people started to look at his work, and coming from all over the world to meet Adolf Dietrich and meet this great painter, because he was actually on a mission to do the best paintings in the world.
It's really, I mean, it comes also natural. It's so natural when you look at the show, like even these pairings, I mean, sometimes there are 100 years in between the two paintings, and like, I think for no one, it wasn't a shock for anyone, you know, it comes all smooth. But when I think of it, it's kind of amazing, you know, that a successful contemporary painter writes an art historical text for Parquet magazine on a colleague who died many years ago, who doesn't really have an international career, then a contemporary artist who co-curates a show and that places the source of his appropriation on the same level as his own work. And I think it's quite radical. I mean, it's for a lot of people, it's hard to see the radicality behind the act and behind what you are doing. But I think it's so dramatically different than, for example, the appropriation in the 80s and appropriation art in general.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in this case, you have my most recent painting, which is a large still life, and then to the right, you have the original painting by Adolf Dietrich. That was, are we?
Oh, no. It's fine. Don't worry.
Okay. And in this case, it's the only painting in the show that has a direct and almost complete reference to the original. But in a way, it's pointing to Dietrich's notion of him being a outside of art as the subject and as the content of the work, and then amplifying it, you know, as though you had like in terms of like a concert metaphor, like a stack of Marshall amplifiers, you know, blasting like feedback out at a ridiculous amount. And that idea of amplification creates its own sense of distortion, like visual distortion and conceptual distortion, where the stability of meaning is being challenged right in front of you. It's here, it's not a meta experience, but it's an experience that you take on physically and visually. And that painting can be, the form of painting can be the carrier of meaning carrying forward. It exists because of its whole-scale acceptance as a benign and practically ineffectual form in contemporary art. But in a way, by advancing the notion of misappropriation as compared to appropriation, it shows an insurgent potential that painting can, in its way of appearing, you know, amongst other kinds of forms of culture, that it actually uses its own acculturation as a weapon to kind of explode meanings where there's little likelihood that they could possibly present a trajectory of change.
That was, if I remember right, that was one theme that kept coming back in our discussions about your work, and then in relationship to Adolf Dietrich. You know,
right.
Let's say the amount of misunderstandings or misinterpretations, really constructive misinterpretations that happen. And you in your work use that a lot. You
Yes.
know, you use images that are highly loaded, and you intentionally use very highly loaded images to trigger a discussion about the content of those images. But of course, you're also you're not afraid of making yourself a target of critique.
Yeah, there are consequences to like setting up those conditions where you drag along the potential for extremely negative of reading of work. That rather than trying to, you know, control the, you know, eventual outcomes of how a viewer might read any single piece of work, that the potential to have it be taken absolutely the wrong way, and that have another content, create another content strain, is a very important part about accepting the consequences of
maybe
proposal.
we should go to this image where the woman is upside down, and Richard. Yeah.
Right.
The both images, could you talk a little bit more about the both images? Because I think that both backgrounds is like kind of partial appropriations of Dietrich winter landscapes. But
well, on the right-hand side, you have an image which is like essentially a beauty shot and a pornographic layout, where you're looking at the portrait as a carrier of an advertisement of a sex act that's going on in the rest of the layout. And on the other hand, so in a way, it's an advertisement for that which isn't there. And in the case of the painting of the Marine, you have, as I was mentioning before, a setup of a model posing as a military officer who is supposed to embody the ideas of service and valor and commitment. The deliberate misuse of both of those images, the displacement of their original, kind of controverts the original intention of appropriation, which would be using the referent to critique an external institution. In this case, the use of Beatrix resetting the context of the work and actually displacing the interrelationship not only within one painting but in both paintings back to a single referent starts another potential for how painting, subjectivity, and criticality can be read. And there's another painting on the opposite side of the room that takes that even further.
I also remember that we often had discussions about, and that again made it so interesting to look at your work in the parallel presence of Adolf Dietrich, is how far can you control that? Where is the moment of control of misreading, or is there even an intention to control misreading, or is there the belief that the power of the image can control that itself? And the same thing is the interpretation of Adolf Dietrich's work is in a way got out of control of the artist,
right.
and there's a distant reading, distant misinterpretations. There was no possibility for him anymore to control.
Right.
And I think that was a crucial moment for that show. You know, what does pure presence enable you to control that? Or how do you control that in a presentation, in a show? And knowing your work and having seen many shows of you, my experience was always that you do that through combinations of works.
Exactly.
There's kind of a cross-pollination of the two misreadings, you know. Actually, misreadings of Dietrich, you benefit from them to a certain extent, because like there's often you hear that it's too explicit what you use, like the imagery that you use, it's kind of too explicit or too literal. And for me, like Dietrich brings like a soft element to the perception of your work in this show. On the other hand, like Dietrich's the naive guy who seems to be far away from anything that could be something like sexiness. And you show like the sexy sides of Adolf Dietrich to a certain extent, or you make him contemporary to a certain extent.
But absolutely, and I think it's interesting to to hear more. Like in the case of the show, two more minutes only.
Okay.
In the case of the show, you co-curated with David Saleh. You also developed this narrative. And what was your narrative for that show?
Well, what Beatrix is referring to is an exhibition that I co-curated with David Saleh at the Haunch of Venison Gallery in New York this past spring. And the title of that exhibition was Your History is Not Our History. And it was a look at artwork that was made in New York City by artists in the 1980s. And it was, in a way, trying to get ahead of the message of what we will now start to see in many institutions, a reassessment of the 1980s, but from an institutional perspective. What we decided to do as two artists was look at that particular, context within that time and see our two different perspectives. Mine being an art student just coming to New York, having no authority, and a central producer of some of the most critical works at that time. And what our interest was to eliminate this split that happens in institutional discourse, where you have theoretical criticism being advanced by one sector, and the idea that painting was a retrograde and negative counterpart to that theoretical production. In fact, painting was a deliberate choice at that time for a conceptual practice to appear in a degenerate form in a certain sense. And yet, the art media in particular chose to keep that separate, and institutions such as universities and so forth continued to perpetuate that falsehood. And so that falsehood became a history. So in a sense, what we were discussing in that show was the idea that that history was not David or myself's history, and that we repositioned them in a very specific installation to undo that notion with the work itself as you see it in front of you at that moment, and not by the meta experience of reading a dissertation about something that actually didn't happen. So this show in a way, is an inversion of that idea, and it brings forward the idea that painting is not simply a benign subject that can be taken at face value, that the historical constructions around history are malleable and can be deliberately misinforming people about what has happened. And so the relaxation that happens with this show, when you see beautiful landscapes, when you see subjects that reappear, like beautiful landscapes appearing in unclear subjects, lets down one's guard to see the machinations of the way in which history can be completely distorted, misused, misappropriated, and taken in directions that are beyond intentionality.
Thank you very much, Beatrix. Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gianni. Thanks.
The big book signing.
Yes. The big book signing, and there's much more content that we were able to pack in this 30-minute salon. And it's a wonderful book designed by Patrick Lee in New York City, printed in Switzerland. And yeah.
I also want to say that
it's
the first of the new Swiss Institute imprints. So this is #1, everybody. And this is I want to congratulate Gianni for this moment, for being able to bring forward. And I'm going to show it right here. There it is. Swiss Institute. So.
We offer it for 40 Swiss francs only at Art Basel, and Richard's going to sign it for free.
This is actually a sales department.
Yeah, that's the other part that we didn't discuss about the show. So.